So hello and welcome to Light from Light. My name's Daniel and we have the privilege today of being joined by Patrick Kenny. Very welcome, Patrick, to be with us here.
Great to be with you and thanks for inviting me on.
Thank you for agreeing. This is a few months in the making, but I'm glad we managed to find a date to sit down and talk about the life of Father Willie Doyle. Patrick, I suppose first of all, would you just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do? A little bit of background there.
Okay, so my name is Patrick Kenny. I'm married and I've 6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys, currently aged from 16 down to 3. And as you asked me off air before we went on air, are any of them named after Willie Doyle? So the youngest one, who's 3, his name is William, and his older brother, who's 6, his name is Joseph William. So both of them have him as a patron in their name. So I'm a lecturer in nothing to do with history or religion or military or saints or Catholicism or anything like that, but in a business school in Technological University, Dublin. And I'm also the president of the Father Willie Doyle Association. So that is a lay association. In canon law, it has the status of a private association of the faithful. And it was founded 4 years ago to promote devotion to Father Willie Doyle and to help push towards his canonization. And we are the official actor for the cause, which is the group that is set up to sponsor and promote and indeed pay for all of the aspects of Father Willie's canonization cause. And I'm also the editor of the book To Raise the Fallen, which is a selection of Father Willie's war letters and prayers, and has some biographical components there as well. And also maybe of interest, with the postulator for the cause of Father Willie, that's Father John Hogan, priest of the Diocese of Meath. We're both co-editors of a book that's coming out later in the autumn called The Rock from Which You Were Hewn, which is a selection of biographies of every Irish person whose canonization cause is currently open. Even anywhere in the world, for instance, there's quite a number of Irish people whose canonization causes are open in America because they went and worked and lived in America. And also a number of people whose causes could be considered people who were known for their holiness but don't have a formal canonization cause. So the saints...
I imagine the numbers... Yeah, I imagine there are a great number, hundreds probably. We have a series on here called Saints in the Making, which Father Willie Doyle would be one of them, essentially. People who are we tend to do ones who are recent in the recent past. People who inspire on the way to canonization. Pat, how did you come across Father Willie Doyle and his life?
So in 2010, a friend of mine recommended that I read the original biography of Father Willie, which was written in 1920 by Alfred O'Reilly. I live in a place called Dunleary, which is about 2 miles away from where Father Willie grew up in Dalkey, and I'd never heard of him. And I went looking for the book and found a copy of it. And when I read the book, I was just really mesmerized and blown away by what I was reading. So I have an interest in the lives of the saints, and I'm regularly reading books about saints, and often very famous, well-known saints. And when I was reading about Father Willie, I was struck with the thought, here is a man who is just like those canonized saints that I'm reading about. Not just in his external activity, his missionary zeal and his heroism in the war, but also in the interior battle, his interior struggle, his interior holiness, and being able to read about what was going on in his soul, in those excerpts from his private diaries that were published by O'Reilly, was a great privilege. And the book struck me in a way that no other book ever has. And a few months after reading the book, I ended up setting up a blog or a website about Father Willie, and ultimately, a lot of things grew out of that blog. So that blog has been transformed to our website, which is the Father Willie Doyle Association website, which is williedoyle.org, and it's updated pretty much every day with a quote from his writings or some reflection on what he was doing on that particular date in history.
Okay. And who is Father Willie Doyle then? How would you describe him as a man and his character, if you like?
So at a very surface level, to give the elevator pitch, as it were, for Father Willie,
Yeah.
I would say he was a holy priest who was willing to die in order to save a person's soul or to save a person's life. And that's ultimately what happened to him. He was ordained in 1907, lived as a priest for 10 years. The last 2 years of his priesthood were spent as a military chaplain in the First World War, and he was killed in August 1917 while rushing out to no man's land to rescue some wounded officers, and they were all killed instantly when a shell fell. And in the years after his death, there was a huge outpouring of devotion to him that's never totally disappeared, but certainly within the last 10 years, there's been a big resurgence of that around the world.
Right. And what was his upbringing like in Dublin then? And did he have any particularly strong friendships, or was his family a big influence on him growing up?
Yes, so he was born in 1873, and interestingly, that's the very same year in which St. Therese was born. They were born about 6 weeks apart from each other, and their childhoods were very, very similar. So if you know anything about the upbringing of St. Therese, I think Father Willie's childhood was pretty similar. They were both the youngest of large families. Father Willie was the youngest of 7. There were a lot of vocations in each family. In St. Therese's family, all of them had religious vocations ultimately. In Father Willie's case, 4 of the 7 did. But he was generally a very ordinary boy. He loved sports. He grew up in Dalkey, which is a beautiful seaside town on the south of Dublin. So he loved fishing, he loved swimming, he loved sailing, cricket, football, tennis, broke a few windows in the family home. And the family grew up, like St. Therese, in a fairly well-to-do, upper-middle-class family, not mega rich, as it were, but very comfortable. And they had servants within the family home. And interestingly, Father Willie's father, who died in his 90s, had a 73-year career in the Irish courts. He started working at the age of 17 and retired at the age of 90. So an incredible work ethic, and I think that's something that rubbed off on Father Willie, because he was always busy, always efficient about what he was doing. So he was one of those real go-getters. If he hadn't been a priest, I think he would have been a very effective businessman and very successful at it, given his personality.
He was probably a particularly successful priest because of that work ethic as well.
Yeah, and his personality, his charism. If we were to pick out a big virtue that he had, it would have been industriousness and fortitude and willpower. So he was one of those people that was a real go-getter. And all of us, we're a mixture of light and dark. We have certain natural strengths and certain natural defects that we have to struggle against. So Father Willie was just like that as well. And so people who have fortitude or industriousness can sometimes suffer from impatience and short temper. And that is something that Father Willie had to struggle against. And later on, when we look at the story, we'll see that he was successful in doing that. And we can see some of the techniques that he used in doing that.
And growing up then, was he quite close with his siblings?
He was close to his siblings, but particularly to one of them, who was his brother Charlie. He was about 2 years older than Willie, and the two of them were completely inseparable as boys, and indeed even, they both became Jesuits ultimately, and Charlie had a big impact on Father Willie's vocation. One story about a charitable activity that the two of them did that really, really touches me, and I think St. Therese would really appreciate it, because it's very much in line with St. Therese's little way, even though Father Willie wouldn't have known about it at the time, is that the family were very charitable to the poor people of the village in which they lived. And people would come to their home at Christmas time looking for gifts or looking for donations of money. And so Willie and his brother Charlie would take the coins that they were giving to the poor, and they would shine them and clean them so that the poor would get a brand new coin. Now, whether the coin is dirty and grubby or bright and shiny doesn't really matter, because the shopkeeper is going to take it and give you the same amount of food.
It's still worth the same.
Whatever, it's still worth the same. But there's an extra dignity in giving something nice. It gives maybe an extra thrill to the person who's getting that coin. And it's a very hidden, secret act of charity. And I think that's key to understanding Father Willie's spirituality later on in life.
Yeah, it's almost recognizing the dignity of the one who's receiving the gift as well.
Yeah, I mean, give your best to others. Don't give your second best, or don't give whatever's left over. So it's certainly recognizing the dignity of the one who has the humility to come to your door and beg. It's a really touching act of charity.
I remember hearing a story about Father Willie in his youth. He used to go and help the poor of the community. In particular, I remember one story where he used to go and paint the houses of those who couldn't afford to decorate their properties. Was there any other stories like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that really marked him out as a young boy, which is a very precocious charity that he had for others. So we're talking about 8, 9, 10 years of age. He would get up in the morning and do some of the work for the servants. So he's a great role model for young boys. Any young boys watching, not that you have servants, but maybe you've got parents who maybe act like servants. So to get up early in the morning and do some of the work. So if there was a dinner the night before and there were dishes that weren't cleaned, as a young boy, Willie Doyle would sometimes get up and clean the dishes or light the fire, or shine the boots that the servants hadn't done. But as you say, he would go to the local poor. He would whitewash their houses. He would bring food to them. He would save up his pocket money to buy things for them. But he also had a great love of practical jokes, and sometimes he would play practical jokes on them. So that's something we see later in his life. But even as a young boy, he once wrapped up a small brick and brought it to a lady, and she thought she was getting a slab of butter, and she was delighted. And she opened it and she saw that it was a brick. He did bring her some butter later on, so it wasn't, it seems like a little bit of a mean joke to play, but it was only a little kid. But he did bring her actual butter later on in that day. But there is an interesting
like a playful character.
Playful, he had that throughout his entire life, a tremendous joy. But there was one story in particular of a man who'd been away from the church for many, many, many years. He had no family. I believe he was an alcoholic, if I recall the story correctly. And he was dying in his cabin and talking, he had no family. Father Willie was there asking him, do you want to see the priest? Will I get the priest? And the man wanted nothing to do with the priest. So Father Willie stayed by his bedside, talking with him and praying for him, I believe, for about 8 hours. And then finally the man relented and said, okay, go and get the priest. So Father Willie ran off, got the priest and brought him back. So in a sense, even as a young boy, that was his first missionary success. And we see this aspect of his life, these key aspects of his life very early on: charity, missionary zeal, a sense of adventure, and good humour.
Wow! And what was his spiritual life like as a child? And was there a particular influence from his parents? Is that where he picked up faith, picked up that love for the Lord?
So it was a very pious family. I mean, probably quite typical of Irish families at the time, to a certain extent. He used to play the organ in the local church. I'm pretty sure he must have been an altar boy in the local church as well. I don't think I've ever seen anything confirming that, but I sense that would have been the case. But the family certainly read spiritual books together, and 3 that we're aware of are The Imitation of Christ, Challoner's Meditations for Every Day of the Year. So Bishop Richard Challoner, that many English Catholics will be familiar with, a book of meditations for every day. And also we know that Father Willie himself read Butler's Lives of the Saints. So big multi-volume set of Lives of the Saints. And he comments later on in life that he devoured the Lives of the Saints, that he loved the Lives of the Saints, and that these had a big impact on him, particularly the lives of martyrs, that these really fascinated him and encouraged him as a young boy. The other thing we know is that he tried to live a bit of a penitential life as a young boy, and he's known for his penance later on in life. And so somebody had walked in on him in a room where he was looking at himself in a mirror, and it was Lent, and he was talking to himself saying, you're not going to get any sweets, I'm going to starve you, you're not going to get any cakes during Lent. So he was gearing himself up for a penitential season in Lent. So that kind of innate asceticism was there even as an early age, combined with a great love of fun, combined with a love of sport, but also combined with some sort of health problem in his stomach. We don't exactly know what it was, a digestive problem of some nature that he seems to have had all his life. We're not told exactly what it was, some sort of cramps, maybe irritable bowel disease or something like that. We've lots of labels and diagnoses for these things today, but maybe not so much 100 years ago. But it's something he suffered from all his life, but he never let it get him down.
It never let him. It never held him back, really. As well, I imagine.
He did have to leave some studies and postpone some studies, and it did slow down aspects of his formation, but he kept persevering through it.
And what made him first think about becoming a priest? Is there any sort of indication of when that first call came for him?
So he was educated at home, homeschooled essentially until the age of 11. And then from 11, he went to Ratcliffe College in Leicester, which last year opened up the Father William Doyle English Centre, the first building in the world to be named after him.
All right.
He's a famous alumnus of that school, famous graduate.
So he spent some time in the UK then.
In the UK, yeah, in Ratcliffe, yeah. So about 6 years in a boarding school there. And it was at that time that his vocation matured. We're not told any particular moment that we're aware of that made that clear, but it doesn't seem that he struggled with it. So many people today maybe have to struggle with that commitment to be a priest or a nun or religious. It seemed to be a natural thing for Father Willie, and I think for many young people at that time, because for so many vocations it was a normative thing to do. For Willie, the struggle was he going to be a diocesan priest or was he going to enter a religious order? And in fact, he didn't want to enter a religious order. When somebody asked him that, he said he'd rather be shot in the head than enter a religious order.
Wow.
He wanted to be a diocesan priest and work in a parish. And I think he was influenced in that by one of his older brothers, Fred, who had entered the Jesuits. I think he'd been a Jesuit for maybe a year or two, did his novitiate with the Jesuits, and then left and entered the seminary for Dublin to become a diocesan priest. And he went to Rome to finish his studies, and he was 10 days from his ordination when he caught a fever and died. And he died 10 days short of his ordination. So Father Willie wanted to replace him as a priest for the Dublin diocese. But his older brother Charlie had entered the Jesuit novitiate, and he really wanted to recruit Willie as a Jesuit as well. Willie didn't really want to know anything about that, but Charlie influenced him, gave him a book to read about it, and was praying for him. And that's what made Willie a Jesuit.
And what was the book, I wonder?
Yeah, so the book was a book by St. Alphonsus Liguori on the religious life.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so, and I suppose what would have influenced Willie there is that the religious life is a greater renunciation than the diocesan priesthood. And I suppose in the world today, a lot of lay people would think, okay, being a diocesan priest is a big renunciation. You're giving up a family, a job, and so on. But a religious is a bigger renunciation because you're making that informal vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, particularly obedience to a superior. Okay, you're living with, everyone is called to chastity, but as a priest, you're living out in a particular way with continence. But the real sacrifice, I suppose, of religious life is the vow of poverty, the vow of obedience. And I think in reading about what St. Alphonsus had to say, he could see the merit or the benefit of doing everything under obedience and being reliant upon others and having to seek permission from his superiors for everything. And I think he was attracted to that level of humility and that actual poverty and poverty of spirit.
Yeah, fitted well with his character. What was his novitiate like then? As a Jesuit, it must be a particularly long time as a Jesuit novice. But what was it like in terms of formation, and did he excel during that time?
Yeah, so his novitiate, his formation would have been broken up into different phases or times. So the novitiate would have lasted 2 years, but then he would have studied philosophy and theology and done pastoral work. So he entered the Jesuits in 1891. And he was ordained in 1907. So it was 16 years of formation, so a very long period of time. Some of that time was spent in Ireland. So he entered a novitiate in a place called Rahan in County Offaly, which is in the Diocese of Meath, and he spent 2 years there. He spent some time studying in Belgium. He spent more time in England, studying in Stonyhurst. More time back in Ireland, studying and also working in two big Jesuit schools, Clongowes and Belvedere, two big, quite famous Jesuit schools. But in the novitiate, there were two key moments that really stand out as being very, very important for him. And the first of these was a fire that broke out in November, I believe it was, 1891. He was 18 years of age, and we're told that as a result of being caught up in the fire and having to evacuate from the building, that he had a complete nervous breakdown. Now,
All
it's
right.
always a question of why, we don't know that any other novice had a nervous breakdown. They may have, but I don't think they did. There's no record of that. So this seems to have been something unique to Father Willie. And the question is, why did this happen? And we don't know why. But in the last few months, just reflecting on some aspects of his life, there's an incident that happened when he was a toddler that really struck me as being potentially a clue to understanding this. When he was maybe 1 or 2 years of age, he was in his cot. There was one of the servants who was beside him as he was going to sleep, and she was knitting by candlelight. And young Willie Doyle fell asleep in the cot, and the servant who was knitting also fell asleep. And in the process of falling asleep, she knocked over the candle into the cot, and the cot went on fire. And
Oh, okay.
Hugh Doyle, Willie's father, smelt the smoke, rushed in, had to take him out of the cot, and threw the blankets and the mattress out the window that was on fire. And I wonder, was there some kind of deep down psychological impact upon him from being caught up in that fire? He joked about it later in life, saying that it was his first experience of fire. But I wonder, did that create an innate fear there? And that makes his heroism in the war all the more impressive, because he volunteered to go there. Having had a nervous breakdown 20 years previously, he's completely transformed from that. And I think that makes him a really compelling figure, not just as a role model, but also an intercessor, because we have so many people today who suffer from mental health challenges, mental health problems. So many young people of all ages suffer from anxiety and so on. And here we have a man who, having suffered this way, came out the other end. So we can look to him as an example, but also as someone to pray to.
So am I right in saying, Pat, that he left his formation for a time and then returned to that? Is that right?
Yeah, correct. Well, he was sent away because of the nervous breakdown, and there was a big question mark as to whether he would be allowed back in. And remember, the Jesuits lived a tough life. So somebody who, remember, he's only been a Jesuit for about 8 months at this stage. He's had a nervous breakdown. It would have been a legitimate question as to whether he's going to be able to stand up to the rigors of Jesuit life, of missionary life. I remember there were so many priests in Ireland at the time. It wasn't as if there was a shortage and we need to handle someone very delicately. So the fact that he was allowed back in is itself quite remarkable. And I believe it was the provincial of the Jesuits who saw the strength of his vocation, and he argued that he should be allowed back in. So it wasn't a very long time that he had to leave, a number of months. So he did get back after a number of months.
Does he write about that time himself?
Not that I recall. I don't remember seeing him reflecting back on a nervous breakdown. It's more that it's in the archival material that he had a nervous breakdown. And in the original biography written by Alfred O'Reilly, it's really just a line. We had a complete nervous breakdown, and he moves on. And I think in today's world, 100 years later, where we have a greater appreciation of mental health and challenges in that area, and we're more open to talking about those challenges, I think we see the potential significance of that for him and for his example for us today in a way that wasn't seen 100 years ago. There might have been a tendency to gloss over a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, he's a good example then, a potential intercessor then for people nowadays. And Pat, what was his priestly life like then after being ordained? There's a good few years before the war starts and he goes off to war as a chaplain. What were those years like as a priest?
Yeah, so just to fill it in, he was ordained in 1907, and interestingly, he was ordained alongside Blessed John Sullivan. So we've three Irish Jesuits whose causes are open. There's a Blessed Dominic Collins, who was an Irish martyr. He's a bit different from, about 400 years ago. But two contemporary Irish Jesuits, John Sullivan and Willie Doyle, they were ordained together on the same day, which is really interesting. And John Sullivan was beatified 7 years ago. So,
and would they have known each other well?
They would have known each other. I don't know how well they would have known each other, because John Sullivan was a bit older. He was a later vocation. So he was raised in the Church of Ireland. His father was the Lord Chancellor of Ireland. And John Sullivan was a well-known barrister in Dublin. He had a conversion of life, converted to Catholicism. So that was a bit of a shock around the social circles of Dublin at the time. And then he decided to enter the Jesuits, which was an even bigger shock. And he lived a life of, obviously as a religious, he's living a poor life, but he really lived his vow of poverty in a very real way. And John Sullivan came from the very highest echelons of Irish society. So it was a real well-known story that this man has had this big conversion. And so Willie, during his time of formation, when John Sullivan had joined, John Sullivan was well enough known that in one of the letters home to his family, he writes as a postscript, "Mr. Sullivan has just joined us." So John Sullivan was not unknown at the time. But I don't know beyond that what contact he would have had, other than that we know that when John Sullivan died, that there were bits of Father Willie's diary that John Sullivan had transcribed out himself and that he kept within his personal prayer books and notebooks and so on. So certainly John Sullivan had an appreciation for Willie Doyle later on in life. So ordained in 1907. He spent a year in Belgium doing Jesuits have, after 2 years of novitiate, and then after ordination they have what's called a tertian year, which is where they go back and do the spiritual exercises again and have a complete spiritual year, once again after all the years of study. And then they're launched out into their apostolate. So he spent another year back in a Jesuit school, and then he was appointed to the Irish Jesuit mission team, which meant that he was travelling around Ireland and to a certain extent parts of Scotland and England, giving missions and retreats. And in the 7 years in which he was on the mission team, we know that he gave at least 152 missions or retreats. Which, when you consider that some of those missions were 2 weeks long, then it's even more.
Oh, wow.
Because like 7 into 152, you're getting 20 odd per year. But some of those are 2 or 3 day retreats, but some of them are 2 week long missions. So he was very, very busy, on the road a lot, traveling a lot. Very effective as a missionary priest. He had a devotion to St. John Vianney, the Curé of Ars. And so he copied aspects of his life, including spending many hours in the confessional each day, but also going out looking for people who were disaffected from the church. And he notes in his diary that he never met a person who he wasn't able to at least bring back to some extent to the church, which is a remarkable thing to say. And there were occasions when he was almost attacked. If there was someone in the church that had been away, someone in the parish who had been away from the church for a number of decades, he would go to visit them in their house. And on some occasions he was nearly attacked by old men that didn't want anything to do with the church. But he'd keep coming back and talk to them about their lives, not even about religion, talk to them about their careers as miners or sailors or even sport or whatever else it was, just to try and meet them where they were at. And eventually they would convert, they would confess either to him there and then, or they would come to the church, come to the mission. So he seemed to have an effect on people. He had this holiness of life that transmitted itself to other people. And there's one great story that's told of a young lady that he met on the streets of England when he was giving a mission one time. And she, poor girl, was working in the streets late at night. And he just walked past her and he just looked at her and he said, "Jesus loves you. Don't hurt him and go home." And that's all he said. Said it in a very gentle, loving way, and went off. And probably thought, probably prayed for her, but didn't think much more of her. And about 2 years later, he was giving a retreat in a convent of nuns in Ireland. And he got an urgent telegram to come up to Dublin to see the Jesuit provincial, who told him there's a lady in a prison cell in England asking for you. He didn't know what this was about, so he got in a boat, went straight over. And it turned out to be that girl. And she told him that his words had a big impact upon her and went to her heart. And she did go home and tried to get off the streets, but she was poor and didn't have any other way to support herself, and ended up back on the streets and ended up being implicated in a murder, was found guilty and was sentenced to death and was due to be executed. And the prison authorities asked her, "Is there any priest or minister or vicar or any religious figure you'd like to meet?" She had no religion, She didn't know anyone, but she said a kind Irish priest who I met 2 years ago, I'd like to meet him again. So they were able to trace Father Willie back. And so he spoke to her in the prison cell, he baptized her, he got permission to say Mass for her, and then he was with her when she was executed. So a remarkable impact of his pastoral gentleness and charity to others.
Wow, just did a few words and had a dramatic impact.
Yeah, it's an example for all of us. We just don't know what words we say, but the words Father Willie said were said with love and said with gentleness and charity, not in a lecturing or harsh way.
And is there any knowledge about how he would preach missions, how he would preach in terms of style, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so we're told that he spoke from the heart. Okay, so there was something, some aspect of holiness about him that communicated itself to others, and that's the testimony we get from people who were at retreats at that time. I mean, I've met a nun, spoken to a nun and she used to teach me actually, and it's only the last year or so that I've met her again, and I knew that Father Willie had given a retreat to her order, and that she wouldn't have been alive then. But she said that she knew a nun who was on the retreats that he gave. And I said, what did she say? And she said, well, she just said about him that he was always very cheerful and joyful and very holy. So there was something about the holiness of life. So, people can preach in a very exalted way and using, all sorts of references to literature and to history. But with Father Willie, I think it was in a very homely way, in a very gentle way. And the words came from the heart. And for instance, on one mission, there were a number of priests. There was a boy at the mission, and the local priest asked him, which missionary priest did you like the best? And the boy said, I liked Father Doyle the best because he was holy. So, even the little children could pick up something about him.
Yeah, in my mind, always holiness and mission go together. You have to have both of them together. There's no point having one without the other.
They have to go hand in hand. He had the zeal for souls. I mean, another nun, who was on a retreat with him said that there's no trouble that he wouldn't take in order to help a soul. No matter what it took to help a soul, he would do it, no matter what it cost him.
And did, as part of the mission, did he have an impact on vocations? Was he involved with that at all?
So the promotion of vocations is one of probably his most lasting and hidden legacies, because we have no idea how many men and women whose vocations he helped. But it's certainly in the hundreds, if not the thousands, because he wrote 2 best-selling pamphlets. They had a big impact, and the reason he wrote them was because the impact of the book by St. Alphonsus on his own life. But the book was quite a big and we thought quite a heavy book, so we thought there should be a smaller pamphlet that encapsulated these ideas. He couldn't find anyone else to write them, so he decided, well, maybe he'd have to write them himself. They didn't have very original titles, but they had very effective titles. One was called Vocations, and the other was called Shall I Be a Priest? But their direct titles probably had an impact on their success as well. So we know that.
Well, you could tell what they were about from the title.
Yeah, so there was nothing obscure about them. And they sold tens of thousands of copies during his lifetime. We know that he helped many people many women, young girls, get into convents. And this is at a time when convents were full and it was maybe hard to get in, particularly if a girl had any health problems. And, if you had a health problem, maybe the convent didn't want to take you in because, you wouldn't be able to do the work, or they had enough healthy girls wanting to get in. So in some instances, we know that he helped girls find places in convents in the US, in England, as far away as South Africa and Australia. But he also helped young boys enter the priesthood. Especially if they couldn't afford the money for the education, he raised money to help poor boys enter the seminary, and he had all sorts of interesting financial schemes to raise money to do that. But for me, the big story about vocations, and one that amazes me, is from a letter I got from an English priest a number of years ago, a retired English priest, and he had been a chaplain in the Second World War. And his chaplain in the Second World War gave him a copy of one of Father Willie's pamphlets. And he read it after the war, and he decided to become a priest. And a few years later, he met the chaplain, and he said, look, I want to thank you for giving me that booklet. It's changed my life. It's the reason I've become a priest. And the chaplain said, well, that's really interesting, because I know at least 11 other soldiers who became priests because they read that pamphlet.
Wow.
So,
and that's just the soldiers from one chaplain.
Soldiers from one chaplain. So that's why I say it must be in the hundreds, if not the thousands, of priestly vocations that he helped. And I know a number of them myself, even today.
And are those pamphlets still available? And are they being read nowadays?
Yeah, they are being read now. They are available. So you can find them on our website, williedoyle.org, but they've also been published as in a book published by Senecal Press from Silverstream Priory in Ireland. And the book is called Pamphlets for the Faithful. So if you go into Silverstream Priory, go onto their website, you can find the book Pamphlets for the Faithful. So it contains Father Willie's pamphlets on vocations, 2 of them. It has one on the rubrics of the Mass, and it has 2 other pamphlets that were quite important. One is on retreats for working men. So he was really interested in helping lay people become holy and become apostles. So, and it was at a time when that was not a popular thing to do. So he was a pioneer in that regard. And also his pamphlet on scruples and their treatment. And this was a pamphlet that was published posthumously. He didn't bring it out during his lifetime, but his notes and reflections for it were there. So those notes and reflections were collated and published after his death. So those pamphlets are available in that Pamphlets for the Faithful.
Wow. And as a priest then, why would he want to go to war? I imagine a priest would be against the war. I imagine Father Willie would be against the war, but why would he go, and why would he desire to go to the war to be a chaplain?
I mean, that is a great question, because he was living what objectively one would have to say a very effective, if not, or successful, however one wants to define that, but it's certainly a very fruitful apostolic life as a priest. There's a lot of other things he did that we didn't get into, raise money for the missions, on the Council of Pioneers, giving spiritual direction to many, many people. So he's living a fruitful priestly life. The war breaks out, and I would say that there are 2 reasons that we can look to. One that he relates himself, and one that we can read between the lines of. The one that he relates himself is that he wanted to suffer for Christ. And interestingly, we said he was ordained in July. That was the 28th of July 1907. On the 7th anniversary of his ordination to the priesthood, the 28th of July 1914, he writes in his diary that at adoration today, Jesus spoke clearly into my heart. And he said, do the hard thing for my sake, because it is hard. And we all know the date that the First World War ended, the 11th of November 1918. There's a number of dates that one can pick when the First World War began, but certainly one of those dates was that day, the 28th of July 1914, when Austria declared war on Serbia. It's the official declaration of war. So Father Willie, in adoration on that day, probably unknown to him that war had broken out, felt this interior call to do the hard thing. And he reflects later on that this war would give him an opportunity to suffer for Christ. And that's something he wanted to do. But also he had a great love for ordinary working men, and it was ordinary working men who were going to war, and he wanted to be there to help them. So he didn't like the war. He wasn't a warmonger. That was a very important aspect of introducing his cause, to ensure that he was not a partisan in the war. He didn't like the war. And from the war, he writes home saying, people at home have no idea what the suffering is like. And if you were here, you would long for peace. So he was a peace-loving man, but he wanted to suffer for Christ and to be there as an apostle with men who were suffering in the war.
It sounds from that prayer that he has a very a deep, almost intimate relationship with our Lord, in the way he speaks about how the Lord prompted him, asked him to go join as a chaplain.
Yeah, this is the case. I mean, one has to be a little bit careful straying into this area, but it seems from his writings that he was something of a mystic. I mean, he reports Jesus said to me, or Jesus spoke to me. So he we're not necessarily talking about visions, There may be locutions or an interior sense of some sort. So certainly we would say his prayer was maybe sometimes dry, but not always dry. He seems to have received quite a number of inspirations like this. And a lot of those inspirations were towards living a hard life, living a penitential life, and in particular, living a penitential life offered up for priests, offered up in reparation for the sins of priests. This is a constant thing that goes through his diary. And in fact, take that same date, 28th of July, 1917, so the 10th anniversary of his priesthood, his ordination, the very last thing he wrote in his private diary is that he offered up his sufferings in the trenches in reparation for the sins of priests. And 3 weeks later, he was dead. So, this sense of intimacy with Christ, this sense of suffering with Christ and for Christ in reparation for sins, a constant theme. And that was an important theme at that time. We don't hear so much about reparation today, but if you go back 100 years ago, there were a lot of saints writing about that. I mean, he was a contemporary of St. Therese, and Therese has this idea of being a victim soul, reparation. St. Gemma Kilkenny around that time as well. And St. Gemma was a big influence of Father Willie's life. And many, many other saints just living of an offering of themselves, doing penance for the sins of others.
And what was he doing on a day-to-day as a chaplain then in the war? How did he approach that?
Yeah, so I suppose in the First World War, from history, the men are in the trenches for a period of time, maybe about 2 weeks at a time, and then they're rotated back to a camp. So Father Willie would be on a rotation with them, spend some time in the trenches with them, and then back at camp. Because he was a chaplain, he had the rank of captain, and he could have availed of various privileges as a captain, but generally he didn't, and he stayed with the men. So being with them, encouraging them, building up their morale, but certainly their spiritual life was very important. And as one of the chaplains who knew him, Father Frank Brown, said, his one thought was to make the men saints. He wanted to make the soldiers holy, but he wanted to be with them in their last moments. And the last moments of our lives are the most important moment of our lives. Secular society doesn't really appreciate that, but our moment of our death is one of the most, it's a moment maybe we fear, but it's one of the most important moments. And to be there with them so that they can turn to Christ in his mercy. And to give them the sacraments. To bury the dead, and it's easy to say bury the dead and move on, but not a pleasant task, because to bury the dead, he has to get out of the trench. He's exposed to gunfire. He says the first time he buried dead, he was doing it at night. He didn't know the words of the burial prayers off by heart, so he was using a torch but trying to hide the light behind his hat, his army hat.
Wow.
And he said the light could sometimes be seen, so stray bullets would fly in their direction. So they'd have to lie on the ground until the shooting stopped. So he learned the prayers off by heart after that, and benefit to knowing our prayers off by heart. So he was risking his life to bury the dead. But to bury the dead doesn't always mean burying a body. Sometimes it means burying parts of a body, because men are destroyed in war. Bodies are destroyed in war. And Father Willie experienced all of that. And again, that's an incredible sign of his transformation, this grace from God, but also transformation from the life of penance he lived and the spiritual life that he lived, that he transcended this nervous breakdown and fear that he had as an 18-year-old, to find him in his mid-40s volunteering to go out to war, surrounded by death, bombs, shells, dead bodies. On the road to the Battle of the Somme, he describes how they had to march on the dead body of men, because there's so many dead bodies. Just had to walk on dead bodies to get to the Battle of the Somme. And this man who's had a nervous breakdown is doing this, inevitably thinking, is this going to be me? But what strikes everyone in the war is that Father Willie is at peace, and even cheerful, and even trying to cheer people up by telling jokes. So he has this tremendous peace and trust in God's providence in the midst of the horror of war.
Yeah, I think that's something that comes across in his letters. So he writes a lot of letters back home, and in his letters you get the sense of great joy that he has. Is that because he has joy, peace in himself, or he's trying to cheer up the family that he's writing to?
I think it's both, to be honest. I mean, he definitely has joy and peace himself, There's no doubt about that. Even though he's afraid, I mean, he definitely feels fear, and he says that in his diaries. You know, he puts on a brave face for the men around him. So, like all of us, I mean, I'm sure, like any martyr who's dragged to death, you know, we read about the martyrs and how they went singing the psalms or full of joy. You can have that joy alongside a natural fear. You know, I mean, it's not that we become supermen or superwomen as Christians. We have the normal human emotions and fears and challenges of everyone else, but somehow or other they're transcended with grace. So that seems to have been the case with Father Willie. So he did have that joy and serenity, but he was also definitely not always giving the full details of the horrors he was facing in the letters. He gives a lot. I mean, he does give a lot. So a classic example of that is in April 1916, he was almost killed in a poison gas attack. It was a couple of days and nights working with men who would suffer from poison gas. He's wearing a gas mask himself, and some gas got in. There was one night where the doctor thought he was going to die. And he writes home and describes this to his family, but he doesn't tell them he nearly died and doesn't tell them that he breathed in the gas. A year later, on the anniversary of the attack, in a letter he writes home, he says, "By the way, I didn't tell you a year ago what really happened." And then he tells them at that point. So there is an element at which he is protecting, particularly his mother was dead at this point, protecting his father, but he's also at peace himself. So both things are coinciding with each other.
And there are a number of heroic stories from his time in the war there of little sacrifices that are built up that he's then able to, this extraordinary moment of sacrifice. One thing stands out where he's in the trenches with the doctor, and the doctor is sick and poorly. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
That is one of my favorite stories of all, because maybe sometimes we might imagine ourselves in a moment of glory risking our lives to save somebody else. You know, I mean, it's like, was it Flannery O'Connor? I think the Catholic author said, referring to one of her characters, she thought she could be a martyr, but only if they killed her quickly. You know, so it's easy for us to imagine a moment of glory, as it were, but to make more hidden sacrifices sometimes are more heroic, and this is one of those. He was with the doctor in a dugout, which is, you know, a bit dug out of the side of the trench, and they move from dugout to dugout as they're moving with the men. And on this particular occasion in the winter, the doctor was sick. He had some sort of fever or flu. We don't exactly know what it was, but he was shivering. He couldn't sleep. They had no blankets. They had no trench sheet, and it was cold, damp, wet ground in winter. And Father Willie was healthy, but the doctor shivering away with whatever was wrong. And Father Willie realizes he's not going to get better like this. So Father Willie lay face down on the ground in the trenches, on the dugout rather, and insisted that the doctor sleep on his back for the night.
Wow.
And that is an incredible act of love, of charity, self-denial and penance. To lie face down on the cold, wet, damp ground and have a sick person lie on your back for the night.
Yeah. The weight of another man on your back.
Another man, the weight of another man on your back. And, you know, Father Willie lived a life of personal penance. He had approval from his superiors for all of this, you know, but, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. It was all of that personal austerity that he willingly embraced that trained him and equipped him for these sacrifices in the war.
Yeah, you would almost trace it back to him standing in front of the mirror at the start of the Lenten practice. Yeah. But those little moments throughout his life. Yeah. And I remember the almost dramatic harrowing mass of the dead that you speak about. I heard you spoke about before. Would you mind telling that?
Yeah. So this was at the Battle of the Somme, and Father Willie is describing. You know, he was a tremendous writer, and he's describing how he has to say mass in using a biscuit box for his altar. You know, so I mean, you have to improvise whatever you can in the war. And the biscuit box was held up by 2 German bayonets. And he said, I was saying mass, and I had the biggest congregation I ever had, all around me on every side, row after row of men, but all were quiet and silent. And he said, when you look about, you see the reason why everyone is silent is because they're dead. All was surrounded by corpses at the Battle of the Somme, and he said some of them had been there just for a few hours, but others had been there for days and weeks, and were foul and horrible to look at, with faces black and green. And he said there he was, holding her Lord in his hand in the Blessed Sacrament, praying for these men who had died, and praying for all the men, because there would have been, I assume, Germans there as well. And Father Willie had a universal charity, helped everyone and prayed for everyone. So, yeah, it's a very powerful image of his time in the Battle of the Somme.
Yeah. You mentioned universal charity. On the day that he died, he was helping two men who were not Catholics. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, and again, that's an aspect of his story that perhaps wasn't focused on so much 100 years ago, but today we see, okay, here he is. He died to save anyone, but it happened that he went out to help two wounded officers who were members of the Church of Ireland. One was from near Belfast, and the other one was from County Meath in Ireland. Both of them had gotten into trouble in no man's land. And Father Willie regularly got out of the trench, went across no man's land to help wounded soldiers, and on this occasion he was trying to help them, drag them back to safety, and they were hit with a shell and killed.
The three of them were killed.
The three of them were killed. Yeah.
Wow. So he died trying to save the life of others, as you said at the outset.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, he was essentially a martyr of charity. He laid down his life for others. I mean, it's one of the things, reflecting back on his novitiate, that I don't think we got to talk about, is that at the end of his novitiate, he made this offering of his life to Mary, promising her to live a life of slow martyrdom and constant self-denial, and asking her that he would have the grace to die as a Jesuit martyr. And in a sense, he did die as a Jesuit martyr, not a martyr for the faith, but a martyr of charity, just like, for instance, Maximilian Kolbe died as a martyr of charity in a concentration camp by stepping forward to volunteer to take the place of a father of a family who was going to be killed, just like St. Damien of Malachi died as a martyr of charity by getting leprosy while working in a leper colony. So he offered his life for charity.
So after he died, there was this biography that's written, and that you referred to, this biography that was sold many copies in different languages. And then, did that have a big impact then on the lay faithful? Did it have a wider impact other than in Ireland?
Yeah, the O'Reilly book certainly had a massive impact. And it's interesting when you see what other people say about the book. For instance, there was a famous, he was actually Irish, but he was in the English Jesuit province, Father James Broderick. Maybe some listeners have come across him. He wrote a number of biographies of Jesuit saints, and he described that book as one of the wisest and most learned spiritual books ever, because the book is a fascinating, not just biography of Father Willie, but a fascinating analysis of Father Willie's spiritual life. And what we would say about Father Willie's spiritual life is that, there are some saints that were great philosophers and great theologians and very original in lots of things they did. But Father Willie was a very practical man, and I think he was a great spiritual tactician, the nuts and bolts of how to be holy. And Father Willie wrote a lot about that in his private diary. O'Reilly went into that in a lot of detail. So the book had a big impact spiritually on other people. It was translated into all of the major languages, major European languages, French, German, Spanish, Italian, Polish, I believe Czech. There were other books, one written by his brother Charlie. His older brother was a Jesuit, called Mary and God. Certainly that was translated into other languages, including into Japanese. The O'Reilly book also may have been translated into Japanese, but certainly material about Father Willie was in Japanese. And it went through multiple
far
editions.
reach. Yeah.
Big reach. And it certainly influenced the lives of other saints. So we know, for instance, that St. Josemaria Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei, he read a Spanish translation of the biography. He writes about an aspect of Father Willie's penance or his asceticism in his own book, The Way, which is where Father Willie struggled to give up butter on his bread. So Father Willie was doing very harsh penance. was also doing smaller penances, one of which was giving up butter on his bread, and he really struggled with it. And that's the thing, we look at holy people like Father Willie, and we think, oh, I could never be like him. They sailed through life. But Father Willie had faults like all of us, and he had struggles like all of us, and he had to struggle to give up butter on his bread, and that's very edifying to me, I have to say.
It sounds almost like Saint Therese. Looking at the great saints and thinking, I can't be like that, so I'll come up with the little way. Yeah.
Just a little way, and he lived it also in many ways. Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa of Calcutta, she had a devotion to him and adopted some of his spiritual practices. I don't know if she read the O'Reilly book, and guess she probably did, but she certainly encountered him, because before setting up the Missionaries of Charity, she was a Loreto nun. She spent some time in Ireland, and I know that the Loreto nuns in Calcutta had a devotion to Father Willie, and there's many letters from them in the Jesuit archives.
Perhaps would they have met? No, obviously wouldn't have met, but they weren't contemporaries.
But they were close to being contemporaries. We know that Frank Duff, founder of the Legion of Mary, servant of God, had a bit of a devotion to Father Willie, and he references the O'Reilly biography 3 times in the Legion of Mary handbook. We know that Canon Taylor and Carfin knew Father Willie. The two of them knew each other, and he had a bit of a devotion to him. Saint Alberto Hurtado, who was a Jesuit from Chile, had a devotion to him and spread materials about him in Chile. We know that Saint Raphael Baron, who was a Spanish Trappist monk, had a devotion to him and references him in his own diary, and many others, all across the last 100 years.
And it's been nearly 100 years, but why has it taken so long for the cause for canonization to open for Father Willie?
And just before I answer that, I thought of another one as well, which was Benedict, as Joseph Ratzinger references Father Willie in, I believe it's his book, Introduction to Christianity. Father Willie is mentioned in that as well. So
it must be amazing for yourself personally, because you have this close connection in terms of proximity of location. Here's a saint, a potential recognized saint, who grew up a few miles from where you lived. So it must be amazingly inspiring.
That's what really, without knowing about the extent of the devotion, while I was reading about him, I was like, this is a man who, he walked the areas that I walk. We saw, not the buildings I see, but the natural, I live near the sea. He saw that sea, he saw that beach, he walked on that hill, he walked on that pier, he was in that harbour. So it brings it home and brings holiness very close to home in that sense. But you asked why the cause took so long. Certainly there was a big push for opening his canonization cause in the 1930s. And dying in 1917, by 1931, we know that there were over 50,000 letters received asking about a cause, or asking for information, asking for prayer cards, asking for relics, reporting favours. We know that there are certainly over 6,000 alleged favours by the early 1930s. And certainly there were many more after that. I don't think we've necessarily counted the number after that. But there were 4 other Jesuits that were renowned for their holiness at the same time. There was Father Willie John Sullivan, who I mentioned. There was Father James Cullen, who was the founder of the Pioneers, which is a movement whereby people give up alcohol in reparation for the sins of alcoholics and to help alcoholics. At one point, it was something like 250,000 Irish people that were members of the Pioneers, so it was a big, big thing. And then there was Father Michael Brown, who was the novice master of the Jesuits. And so there was unanimous agreement to proceed with Father John Sullivan's cause. And in relation to Father Willie's cause, it was said, look, we'll leave it to Providence and see what happens. And that was in the 1930s. Now, devotion to Father Willie never completely died out, although it wasn't always evident throughout certain decades. And just to show us a sign of how global it was, for instance, we know that there was a scouting group in the Netherlands named after him, the William Doyle Scout Group. We know that there was a school named after him in Sri Lanka. Okay, also all of this happening in the 30s. So we see a very global level of devotion to him. We know that, for instance, if you're familiar with her, Sigrid Undset, the Nobel Prize winning author and convert, had a devotion to Father Willie as well. So she was from a completely different culture in Norway. So it's this universal appeal to people. So it never totally died out. But I suppose books and materials published about him kind of fizzled out to some extent. But we know that certainly into the 60s and 70s, they were still producing relics and distributing them. But then from about 2010 onwards, it begins to grow again. And as I said, the Father Willie Doyle Association was founded in 2020, only 4 years ago, and the cause was opened in 2022. And certainly we're seeing devotion from all over the world, particularly young people, particularly young priests are really inspired by Father Willie and by his heroism. And I think when people get to know him, they'll be like, who's this man? I don't know anything about him. And then they learn a little bit about him and they see that here's this very holy priest, but a very manly priest, okay, and a great example for men, but someone who's very gentle, okay, so he's not abrasive or aggressive. So he appeals to men, he appeals to women, he appeals to people of all ages. He appeals to people who don't have faith, because there's a lot of skepticism about Catholicism or about religion. But here's a man, even on a human level, that you can admire for his human qualities and for his willingness to lay down his life to save others. So Father Willie has a very broad appeal out there.
Yeah, he's also a great example a great example as a priest, when the reputation really of priests is so low. And Pat, just finally, then, if in the future, then what role can the association have in furthering his cause, and how can people, if they feel interested to know more or to get involved with the promotion of the cause, how can they go about that?
Yeah, so the Father Willie Doyle Association is what's called the official actor or sponsor of the cause. And so every cause has to have an actor. The actor is the one that petitions a bishop to promote a cause, or to open a cause rather. And the actor has to raise the money to pay for everything. And there, you might say, why does that cost money, or how does it cost money? It actually can cost quite a bit of money over time, but it's over time. So thankfully it's not all in one go. And it's relatively unusual for a lay association to do it in this part of the world. It's more common in Italy or Spain or France, places like that. Normally it's a religious order, or it's a parish or a diocese or a religious movement that somebody is a member of. But the work we're doing it in conjunction with and with the support of the Irish Jesuits, so they are supporting the cause as well. At the moment, the cause is open. It's going through, as we're recording this, the diocesan phase in the Diocese of Meath, and we hope that within the next 12 months that diocesan phase will be completed, and that the cause will then go to Rome. And at that point, some official biographies and documents called Positio, outlining the case for His Holiness, will be produced and submitted. And that's then sent to some theologians who have to study it and to see the ultimate question: did this man live a life of heroic virtue? There's not much any of us can do to help that aspect, but where we can help, number one, is to pray for the work, which is very important. Number two, to pray for miracles. So for any canonization cause to succeed, you need verified miracles. And the standard you have to reach for that is actually very, very high. And I know sometimes people think, oh, the standard of canonization has dropped in recent years, or it's not as rigorous as it was before. No, it's every bit as rigorous. So roles have changed. There isn't a devil's advocate anymore, but the devil's advocate role, which is someone who would argue against the holiness of a person, that was a role that's only a few centuries old. It doesn't go back to the very earliest days of the church. So we now have panels of theologians who approach everything with a skeptical view. And if they see any defects, they will raise it as a criticism. So, this process is very rigorous. So you need a miracle, which is normally, there are some non-medical miracles that have been approved for saints, but they're quite rare. Normally it's a medical healing. And something where you've prayed to the person and prayed to the candidate, Father Willie or whoever else it might be, and the person who's sick gets better in a way that's medically inexplicable, that there's no treatment that they've taken that can explain it. So somebody who has cancer and the cancer disappears and they've had no treatment, there's no medical explanation why cancer should disappear. And there's two things I would ask people if they want to do this for Father Willie, or indeed for anyone else. If there's somebody else you have a devotion to. I think, for instance, of Blessed Dominic Barbary, the Italian Passionist, a lot of devotion to him in England. So, for instance, if God forbid somebody was diagnosed with cancer on Friday, had a scan, was told they had cancer, and due to go back for another scan on Monday, just to give this hypothetical example, and over the weekend they pray and are blessed by relics of both Father Willie and Blessed Dominic Barbary, and they go back on Monday and their cancer is gone. This is a wonderful healing for that person, and there has been a miracle, but it won't help the cause of either Father Willie or Blessed Dominic Barbary, because two people were prayed to. So the miracle has to be attributed just to one person. So just have faith in one person, whoever it might be. And then secondly, if you do have a favour, even if you think it's not significant, report it to us. You need to report it, and then we'll follow up. Our postulator, Father John Hogan, he will be in touch and follow it up. So if you go to williedoyle.org, there's a lot of information there. There's a lot of resources. But there's a form there where you can request prayer cards and leaflets. We'll send them out to you. There's a form there where you can ask for prayers through Father Willie's intercession. We put them in a book of intentions of it, Father Willie. There's a form there where you can report favours if you feel that you've received a favour from someone, or from Father Willie rather, and you want to report that. And then there's also a donate button if you feel you want to help us financially as well, to donate. But another thing, if you want to help us, is to invite us to give a talk in your area. And whether that's in Ireland or indeed in the UK, we will come over as well. We can bring some of Father Willie's items with us, thanks be to God, items that personally belong to him. So I have here, for example, his crucifix. We can bring this along. And other items that he owned that thankfully have been preserved and are under, thanks to the Jesuit archives, under the custody temporarily of the Father Willie Doyle Association. So we can bring them to a talk, to a parish, to a conference. So just get in contact with us on the website, williedoyle.org, and there's an email address, info@williedoyle.org.
And are there any physical places that people can go? You spoke there about Leicester. Is there anywhere in Ireland?
Yeah, so you can visit a church in Dalkey where he was baptised, and you can see the house that he grew up in. There's a plaque outside it. It's Melrose on it's no secret, it's on the website, it's fairly well known, Melrose on Dalkey Avenue. It's in all the books. It's still there. You can find it on Google Maps. You can contact us. I live near Dalkey. I'm happy to meet anyone who's happens to be in the area and wants to know more about Father Willie. But ultimately, we don't have his body. His body was never recovered. So there's no shrine. I suppose ultimately, in the longer term, we'd love to have a proper shrine erected to Father Willie with some of his relics. I mean, we have a number of items that belong to him, but the only first-class relics we have are a little snippet of his hair from his first ever haircut, and that offering of his life to Mary that I mentioned earlier, which he signed in his blood. So a bit of his blood, we have that as well. But ultimately, we want to set up a shrine. So anyone who's happens to want to help us with that, or has won the lottery or something, wants to help us, we'd be happy to hear from them.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Pat, for your time and sharing the wonderful life of Father Willie Doyle. And we invite people to check out the website to look at that for more information. And we'll be back soon again with more episodes along the line of this Saints in the Making. But thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.